The searing New Mexico sun beat down on Dust Creek, baking the earth into a brittle, cracked canvas. It was 1874, and the air itself seemed to hum with forgotten sorrows and unwritten futures. For Elijah Eli Boone, a lone figure on a black stallion named Whisper, loneliness was a chosen companion. His ranch, a solitary outpost carved from the unforgiving landscape, was a sanctuary from a past he couldn't outrun, a past etched into the weary lines around his eyes and the phantom ache of old war wounds. He herded his cattle, a stoic sentinel against the vast, empty plains, seeking nothing more than the quiet rhythm of the land. But Dust Creek, despite its surface calm, was a town on the brink. Rumblings of the railroad's relentless march westward were growing louder, a metallic clang of progress threatening to shatter the fragile peace. And where there was opportunity, there were vultures. Silas Merck, a land baron with a smile as false as a gambler's promise and a grip as tight as a noose, was already circling. He fanned the flames of fear and greed, his eyes fixed on the Navajo lands, his methods as ruthless as the desert itself. Sheriff Granger, a man whose betch seemed to weigh heavy with unseen compromises, did little to stem the tide. Today, however, the ominous hum of the railroad and the machinations of Merck were far from Ellie's mind as he rode near the outskirts of town, checking a distant fence line. The silence was broken only by the creak of leather and the soft thud of Whisper's hooves. Suddenly, a distant wail, thin and sharp like a broken sliver of glass, pierced the stillness. It was a child's cry, laced with a raw desolation that turned Ellie's gut cold. He spurred Whisper forward, his stoic facade cracking under the unexpected assault of a sound too familiar, the echo of loss. Every instinct screamed for him to ride away, to maintain his carefully constructed solitude, but the cry pulled at something deeper, a forgotten shred of the honorable man he once was. As he drew closer, the scene solidified into a tableau of brutal violence. A small homestead, its walls splintered and its spirit broken, smoldered against the unforgiving sky. A woman lay crumpled on the ground, a dark stain spreading on her dress. And beside her, a tiny figure, barely more than a bundle of rags, wept. 6-year-old Lottie Harper, her small hands clutching a tattered doll as if it were the last tether to her shattered world, looked up. Her eyes, wide and luminous with unshed tears, locked onto Ellie's weathered face. The question, delivered in a voice barely a whisper, was a plea that bypassed his armor and struck him deep in the heart. Elijah felt the weight of Lottie's pleading gaze, a gaze that shattered the brittle shell of his self-imposed isolation. He knelt, his eyes scanning the ruin of the Harper homestead. Clara May, pale and still, lay amidst the rubble, a crude cut bleeding slowly from her temple. He quickly assessed the damage. This wasn't random banditry. The precision of the destruction, the focused attack on the dwelling, spoke of a calculated brutality. Merck's men, no doubt. The bastard had wasted no time. "Mama." Lottie whimpered again, tugging on his sleeve. He gently pushed her behind him, Silverbolt, his treasured revolver engraved with his fallen brother's name, already in his hand. The air hung heavy with the scent of fear and smoke. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew violence intimately, his gaze sweeping the horizon for any lingering threat. Finding none, he turned his attention to Clara. She stirred, moaning softly. Clara May blinked, her eyes fluttering open to reveal a searing pain and a fierce determination. She stared at Eli, then at the devastation of her home, finally settling on Lottie's small, shaking form. They tried to make us leave," she whispered, her voice raspy. Her words, though weak, carried the conviction of a woman who had fought and was ready to fight again. Eli knew Merck's game. The railroad was an excuse, a smokescreen. Merck wanted land, and he didn't care whose bones he ground to dust to get it. This attack wasn't just about property. It was a declaration of war against anyone who stood in his path. The whispered plea of a 6-year-old had drawn Eli into a conflict he desperately wanted to avoid. His mind reeled, bombarded by memories of muddy fields and broken promises of lives he couldn't save. He was a man who'd seen enough war to last several lifetimes, and running from it had become his only skill. But then Lottie, with a bravery that seemed too vast for her small frame, stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Eli. Her simple question cut through the fog of Ellie's memories, rooting him firmly in the present. He looked at Clara May, who, despite her injuries, watched him with an intensity that demanded an answer. The silence stretched, broken only by the whimpering of a wounded dog in the distance. Eli knew, with a grim certainty, that his quiet life on the range had just come to an abrupt and violent end. Eli helped Clara May to her feet, supporting her as she swayed. "We need to get you to Doc Mercer," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, though his touch was surprisingly gentle. He'd known Doc Mercer from long ago, a lifetime ago it seemed, when they were both caught in the bloody maelstrom of war. The old doctor had mended more than just broken bones. He'd stitched up soles, or at least tried to. Clearing a path through the debris, Eli lifted Lottie onto Whisper's saddle, the girl small and slight against the massive horse. He then helped Clara May mount, her movements stiff with pain and exhaustion. As they rode toward town, the silence was heavy, broken only by the creak of leather and Clara May's shallow breaths. Every thump of Whisper's hoofs brought Eli closer to the very thing he'd spent years avoiding: entanglement. He was a man of routines, of predictable solitude. The sun rising, the cattle grazing, the endless expanse of sky, these were his constants. He'd built an impenetrable wall around himself, brick by brick, each one a buried memory of the battles waged, the friends lost, the promises shattered. The ghost of every fallen comrade, particularly his brother, whose name was etched onto Silverbolt, rode with him daily. The war had taken everything, leaving him with an honor he didn't always understand, and a deep-seated reluctance to connect. Yet Lottie's plea, so innocent, so desperate, had pierced his carefully constructed defenses. He glanced back, seeing the ruins of the Harper home dwindling in the distance. This assault, orchestrated by Merc, wasn't just a brutal eviction. It was a stark reminder of the lawless chaos that threatened to consume the frontier. Merc's declaration that Clara's deed was invalid was merely a tactic, a flimsy shroud over his ruthless intentions. Clara May, though silent, emanated a fierce resolve. She was a survivor, clearly, but against a man like Merc, backed by hired guns and a corrupt sheriff, strength alone wouldn't be enough. Eli knew the look in Merc's eyes, had seen it in plenty of men during the war, the hunger for power, the disregard for human life. He'd tried to outrun such men, to forget such battles. But here, on this dusty road, drawn by a child's plea, he knew that the war, for him, hadn't truly ended. It had simply changed battlefields. When they reached Doc Mercer's small, dusty office, the old doctor peered over his spectacles, a look of weary recognition crossing his face. "Eli Boone," he grunted, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Doc," Eli replied, his voice gruff. He helped Clara May dismount, then gently lifted Lottie down. While Doc Mercer set about examining Clara's wound, Eli stood awkwardly, his gaze sweeping the familiar yet alien surroundings of Dust Creek. It had been years since he'd set foot in town, years he'd spent trying to forget the faces and places that reminded him of a life he'd lost. Lottie, meanwhile, clung to his leg, her small hand clutching his trousers. Her silent trust was a heavy burden, yet strangely not unwelcome. As Doc Mercer pressed a cool cloth to Clara's forehead, he murmured, "So, it was Merc's men again, was it? Heard about Elias Harper's accident a while back." Clara May's eyes, though hazy with pain, hardened. "He wants the land for the railroad. The law in Dust Creek ain't worth the paper it's printed on when Merc's involved," Doc growled, glancing pointedly at Eli. Eli nodded, the grim reality settling in. His initial instinct to simply ensure Clara May and Lottie's safety and then ride away was becoming increasingly difficult to justify. Merc wasn't just a threat to them, he was a cancer on the entire territory. But what could one man, a man who consistently failed to protect those he cared about, do. His past, a relentless shadow, began to creep in. The faces of his fallen comrades, his brother's easy smile, the sound of gunfire and screams, they all pressed in on him. He tried to bury those memories under layers of solitude and hard labor, but Lottie's innocent gaze and Clara May's fierce determination were digging them all up. Clara May, though weak, spoke directly to Eli, her voice low but clear. "I don't know why you stopped, mister, or why you brought us here, but Silas Merk won't stop. He'll be back." Her words were not a plea for help, but a statement of fact, an unspoken challenge. Eli looked at her, at Lottie, who had now leaned her head against his leg, her eyes closed in exhaustion. He had come across them by chance, a silent witness to a brutality he had long sought to escape. Now the question was no longer if he would get involved, but how deeply. Eli spent the next few days shuttling between his lonely ranch and Dust Creek, bringing necessities for Clara, May, and Lottie where they were staying at Doc Mercer's. Each visit was a small step back into a world he had long forsaken. Clara May, mending slowly, watched him with a wary gratitude. She was strong, fiercely protective of Lottie, but the strain of her husband's confusing death, an obvious murder to Eli, and the relentless pressure from Merk had taken their toll. Lottie, however, took to him with an unwavering innocence that both charmed and unsettled him. She asked simple questions about his horse, about his life on the ranch, about why he was always so quiet. Her curiosity was a scalpel, peeling back layers of the defenses he'd built, forcing him to confront the emptiness within. He found himself answering, hesitant at first, then with an ease that surprised him. He even carved a small wooden bird for her, a gesture so far removed from his usual stern demeanor that it made the corners of Doc Mercer's eyes crinkle. One blistering afternoon, as Eli helped Clara board up the remnants of her Harper homestead, 3 of Merk's men rode up. Among them was a familiar face, a man named Jesse Cole. Ellie's gut clenched. Cole had ridden with him in the war, a good man then, a loyal soldier. Now he wore Merk's livery, his eyes hard and empty. "Boone," Cole said, his voice flat, a hint of shame in his averted gaze. "Merk says this land is forfeit." Eli straightened, his hand instinctively going to Silverbolt's grip. "This land belongs to the Harpers." "Merk says otherwise," Cole insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "He's got papers saying the original claim was invalid." The air crackled with tension. Eli saw the conflict in Cole's eyes, the ghost of a shared past warring with the cold reality of his present employment. He debated what to do. Outnumbered, with Clara, May, and Lottie nearby, a direct confrontation was reckless. "Tell Merk," Eli said, his voice low, "that some things are worth fighting for." He held Cole's gaze, a silent challenge passing between the 2 former comrades. Cole hesitated then, with a curt nod to his companions, turned his horse and rode away. Clara May watched them go, then turned to Eli. It wasn't a question of fear, but of grim certainty. Eli nodded. This was no longer just about protecting Clara May and Lottie. It was about facing down the very forces that had driven him to isolation in the first place. The ghosts of his past were not just haunting him. They were riding directly into his present. Eli spent the following days and nights at the Harper homestead, working tirelessly to make it habitable again. He patched walls, cleared debris, and mended fences, his movements economical and strong. He found a quiet satisfaction in the physical labor, a stark contrast to the churning thoughts within him. Clara May, despite her protestations of being able to help, was still weak but watched him with growing curiosity. Lottie, though, was his constant shadow, her presence a balm to his scarred soul. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Lottie approached him. She held a small, exquisitely carved wooden locket in her hand, intricately detailed with a sprig of wildflowers. "Papa made this for Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She then held it up to Eli. "He told me to give it to someone strong." Eli took the locket, his calloused thumb tracing the delicate carvings. It was a beautiful piece, clearly made with love and great care. He felt a pang of unexpected tenderness. Lottie's eyes, wide and trusting, met his, reflecting the last embers of the sunset. This innocent gesture, this simple act of profound faith from a child who had lost so much, was a revelation. It wasn't a plea for marriage, not directly, but a silent, powerful request for protection, for stability, for the return of a hope she'd nearly lost. It mirrored Clara May's earlier quiet challenge, amplifying it tenfold. Later that night, long after Lottie and Clara May were asleep, Eli sat alone amidst the shadowed ruins of the barn. He fiddled with the small wooden locket. He ran his fingers over the clasp, feeling a slight deviation in the wood. Prying it open, he found not a picture, but a minuscule, tightly folded piece of paper, a deed. Not just any deed, but the original deed to the Harper land, legally registered and clearly outlining their undisputed ownership, complete with dates and land survey markers that made Merck's claims utterly baseless. It was a secret, hidden map, confirming the Harpers' legitimate claim and, by extension, Merck's blatant fraud. This wasn't just about a piece of paper. It was about the truth. Elias Harper hadn't been careless. He'd been cunning, anticipating Merck's treachery. And now, Eli held the proof in his hand. The discovery was a turning point. It wasn't just about saving Clara and Lottie from Merck's greedy clutches. It was about justice. It was about righting a wrong. It was about finding a purpose beyond merely surviving the echoes of his own past. He realized with a jolt that in protecting this small family, he might just find a way to redeem a piece of his own fractured soul. The hermitage was over. He looked towards the distant lights of Dust Creek. Eli rode into Dust Creek at dawn, the small locket now securely tucked inside his vest. The town was beginning to stir, a few grizzled prospectors and weary merchants opening their establishments. He headed straight for Buck Talbot's saloon, a place whose rough and tumble reputation mirrored its owners. Buck was known to play both sides of the fence, but Eli knew him to be a man who, deep down, valued a fair shake. Maybe he could be swayed. He found Buck polishing glasses behind the bar. "Morning, Eli," Buck said, without looking up. There was no judgment in his voice, only a shrewd observation. "Morning, Buck," Eli replied, placing a silver dollar on the bar. Buck scoffed. "Merck steps on toes. He steps on hands. He steps on necks. Been doing it for years with Granger looking the other way." Eli leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I found something." He pulled the tiny deed from his vest and unfolded it, placing it on the scarred wood of the bar. Buck picked it up, his eyes widening as he read the carefully handwritten script, the official seals, the precise demarcations. This is Harper's original deed," Buck breathed, his voice laced with uncharacteristic surprise. "This proves Merck's claims are all lies. He lied," Eli stated simply. Buck's face hardened. He was a man who understood a rigged game, but outright murder and fraud were a different matter. "This could bring him down," he murmured, looking at the document, then back at Eli. "But Merck won't go down easy." "I know," Eli said, his gaze unwavering. "But the town deserves to know the truth." Buck thoughtfully rubbed his chin. "The summer festival's tomorrow." A slow grin spread across Buck's face. "That'd be the place to do it, wouldn't it?" Eli nodded, a grim determination settling over him. He was tired of running, tired of the ghosts. This wasn't just about Clara, May, and Lottie anymore. It was about standing for something, for himself, for the memory of his brother, for the very idea of justice in a lawless land. The summer festival was a riot of color and noise, a momentary reprieve from the harsh realities of frontier life. Children chased each other, music drifted from the saloon, and the aroma of roasted various meats filled the air. Silas Merck, true to form, stood at the makeshift podium in the town square, his self-important voice booming over the festivities. He was mid-speech, pontificating about progress and the coming railroad, deftly weaving in a convoluted narrative about necessary acquisitions and invalid claims. a thinly veiled attempt to justify his theft of the Harperland. Just as Merc reached the crescendo of his lies, Eli walked into the square. He moved with a quiet purpose, his gaze fixed on Merc. The crowd parted, a ripple of surprised recognition spreading through the townsfolk who knew him as the reclusive rancher. Clara May stood near the edge of the crowd, Lottie clinging to her hand, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. Doc Mercer was there too, his old eyes fixed on Eli with a knowing glint. Even Sheriff Granger, usually just a shadow of Merc, watched warily. Ellie's voice, deep and resonant, cut through the festive din, silencing the land baron mid-sentence. Merc's sneering smile faltered. "Boone, thought you were busy rustling sympathy out on the Harper place." Eli slowly pulled the tightly folded deed from his vest. He unfolded it deliberately, the crackle of the old paper loud in the sudden silence. "This is Clara May Harper's deed," he announced, holding it high for all to see. "The original, properly filed and registered. It proves this land belongs to her and her daughter." A murmur swept through the crowd. Merc's face contorted, his pale skin flushing with fury. "That's a forgery," he roared, pointing an accusing finger at Eli. "You're trespassing on railroad property, Boone." Merc's hired guns, including a grim-faced Jesse Cole, drew their weapons, stepping forward. The festive atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a tense, deadly stillness. Ellie's hand went to Silverbolt, his eyes sweeping over Merc's men. He was outnumbered, but he was ready. He had walked towards this fight, a man who had finally found something worth shedding his quiet, haunted life for. Merc's order to kill Eli fractured the stillness. A gunfight erupted, shattering the festive atmosphere. Lead flew, splintering market stalls and kicking up dust as the townsfolk scattered, seeking cover. Eli moved with practiced efficiency, Silverbolt barking defiance. He had faced these odds before, in bloodier fields, and his aim remained true. 2 of Merc's men fell, their surprise evident in their eyes. Jesse Cole, however, held his fire. He watched Ellie's grim determination, the raw justice in his actions. A flicker of recognition passed between the old comrades. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, Cole turned his pistol and shot one of Merc's remaining thugs. The sound was a deafening crack that seemed to echo Merc's infuriated yell. Merc shrieked, aiming his own pistol. Before Merc could fire, a shot rang out from the crowd. Doc Mercer, surprisingly nimble for his age, stood with a smoking shotgun, having blown a hole through the hat of another thug. His eyes, usually kind, were steel. From the saloon, Buck Talbot emerged, a scattergun leveled, his loyalties finally decided. He bellowed, firing a warning shot that sent more of Merc's goons scrambling. Even Sheriff Granger, his face pale, seemed to find a forgotten spark of honor. He drew his own sidearm, not at Eli, but at the last remaining Merc henchman. The fight, once a brutal ambush, was turning. The townsfolk, emboldened by the sudden shift in allegiance, began to emerge from cover, muttering threats, some even picking up discarded weapons. Merc, seeing his empire crumble, let out a guttural roar and fled, ducking into Buck's saloon, undoubtedly seeking some advantage. Eli didn't hesitate. He rushed after him, past the confused shouts and the fading echoes of gunfire. He found Merc inside, overturning tables, trying to barricade himself in the back room. Ellie's voice boomed inside the confined space. Merc snarled, lunging for a hidden rifle. Eli moved faster, Silverbolt a blur. Merc fell, a bullet in his chest. But as he went down, his finger twitched on the trigger, and a shot barked, catching Eli in the side. He stumbled, clutching his wound. Lottie, having followed him, her child's curiosity eclipsing her fear, rushed in, her doll clutched to her chest. She saw Eli fall, and her small face crumpled. Eli knelt, pain lashing through him, but he forced a weak smile. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing her cheek. Eli awoke to the scent of something clean and the distant sound of hammering. Pain, a dull throb in his side, was the first sensation. He opened his eyes slowly, the familiar yet unfamiliar ceiling of Doc Mercer's back room coming into focus. Clara May sat beside his cot, her hand resting gently on his. Lottie, perched on a stool nearby, was carefully drawing in a worn notebook. "You're awake," Clara May whispered, a relief, soft and profound, in her voice. "Barely," Eli rasped, trying to sit up, a sharp pain reminding him of Merc's parting shot. Doc Mercer entered, his face grim but relieved. "You'll live, Boone. Lost a bit of blood, but nothing a few weeks of rest won't fix. Lucky shot, I reckon." Clara May explained the aftermath. Merc was dead, his reign of terror over. Jesse Cole had stuck around, and after Merc's death, had disappeared as quickly as he'd come, presumably to find a new path. Buck Talbot was hailed as a local hero, his saloon now a hub of lively discussion and renewed hope. Even Sheriff Granger, though still tight-lipped, had begun to enforce the law fairly. The fear of Merc's shadow lifted. The railroad, with Merc gone, continued its advance, but the land disputes in Dust Creek would now be handled legitimately. Months later, the Harper homestead was fully restored, even better than before. The community, rallied by Clara May's quiet strength and Ellie's actions, had contributed time and resources. The Harper ranch prospered, thanks to Clara May's resilience and Ellie's steady hand. He now lived there, his own ranch somewhat neglected, but his presence on the Harper land was quiet, strong, and unwavering. He wasn't a husband yet, at least not in name, but he was undeniably a father figure to Lottie. He taught her to ride, to recognize the tracks of various animals, to understand the rhythms of the land. She no longer asked him to marry her mama. She simply knew he was there, a constant presence, a promise kept. One afternoon, riding Whisper back to the ranch after checking some distant fences, he saw her. Lottie, a small whirlwind of joyful energy, ran to him, her bright laughter echoing across the prairie. He dismounted, and in one fluid motion, lifted her onto Whisper's back, a gentle smile gracing his lips. Doc Mercer's voice, raspy with age and wisdom, seemed to narrate the scene from a distant, unseen vantage point. Some men ride away from war looking for nothing. Others ride into a town and find everything they didn't know they were missing. To little Lottie Harper, Elijah Boone wasn't a hero. Months turned into a year. The scorching sun still beat down on Dust Creek, but a subtle change had taken root. The tension that once hung heavy in the air had dissipated, replaced by a cautious optimism. With Silas Merc gone, the shadow over the town had lifted, allowing honest folk to breathe easier. The railroad still pressed westward, but without Merc's corrupt influence, its expansion proceeded with less brutality and greater adherence to the law. The Harper homestead, once a symbol of Merc's cruelty, was now a vibrant testament to resilience and fresh starts. The once damaged house stood proud, fully repaired and expanded. The fields were well tended, the cattle healthy. Clara May, her initial wariness towards Eli now a thing of the past, managed the ranch with quiet competence, her strength evident in every line of her capable hands. Eli was a permanent fixture, his presence on the Harper land as natural as the sunrise. He was still a man of few words, his stoicism deeply ingrained, but his actions spoke volumes. He worked side by side with Clara May, his vast ranching knowledge complementing her determination. He wasn't a husband, not yet. Their relationship was a slow-burning ember, built on shared trials and an unspoken understanding, but not rushed into a commitment he wasn't yet ready for, or perhaps, still learning how to truly embrace. His focus, however, seemed to perpetually orbit Lottie. He taught her how to whittle small figures from wood, patiently showing her how to handle a knife. He walked her through the fields, pointing out different plants and animal tracks. He answered her endless questions with a gentle patience that would have been unimaginable to the Eli Boone of a year ago. She was the anchor that finally tethered him to the present, loosening the grip of his past. The haunted look in his eyes had softened, occasionally replaced by a warmth that reached all the way to his lips. One golden afternoon, just as the sun began its descent, Painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, Eli rode Whisper back to the Harper Ranch. He saw Lottie, barely discernible as a speck on the horizon, running towards him, her small legs a blur against the dusty earth. A wide grin split his face, a genuine, unburdened smile that reached his eyes. He dismounted, and as she reached him, he scooped her up, her bright laughter echoing across the prairie. He swung her onto Whisper's broad back, her squeals of delight a symphony to his ears. Doc Mercer, watching from his porch in town, pulled on his pipe, exhaling a plume of smoke into the quiet evening air. "Some men ride away from war looking for nothing," he mused, his voice filled with the wisdom of years. "Others ride into a town and find everything they didn't know they were missing." To little Lottie Harper, Elijah Boone wasn't a hero. Eli, now riding slowly, Lottie perched happily in front of him on Whisper, looked out at the vast, open land. It was no longer a place to hide, but a place to grow, a place where a man haunted by the past could finally, truly belong. The whispers of a little girl, the silent plea, had indeed been answered. "Fade out,"